So this video is on emotions. As we move through our daily lives, we experience a variety of emotions. Emotion is a subjective state of being that we often describe as our feelings. The words emotions and moods are sometimes used interchangeably, but most psychologists use these words to refer to two different things. Typically, the word emotion indicates a subjective affective state that is relatively intense and that occurs in response to something we experience. Emotions are often thought of to be consciously explained and intentional. Mood, on the other hand, refers to a prolonged, less intense affective state that does not occur in response to something we experience. Mood states may not be consciously recognized and do not carry the intentionality that is associated with emotions. There are several theories to explain emotions. One of them is the James Lange theory of emotion, asserted that emotions arise from physiological arousal. Recall that you have learned about the sympathetic nervous system and our fight or flight response when threatened. If you were to encounter some threat in your environment, like a venomous snake in your backyard or a barking dog, your sympathetic nervous system would initiate significant physiological arousal, which would make your heart race and increase your respiration rate. According to the James Lange theory of emotion, you would only experience a feeling of fear after this physiological arousal had taken place. Furthermore, different arousal patterns would be associated with different feelings. An alternative theory is called the Cannon-Bard theory, and it was developed according to this view. Physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously yet independently. So when you see a venomous snake or a barking dog, you feel fear at the same time that your body mounts its fight or flight response. This emotional reaction would be separate and independent of a physiological arousal, even though they co-occur. A third theory, is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion, is another variation on theories of emotions that takes into account both physiological arousal and emotional experience. According to this theory, emotions are composed of two factors, physiological arousal and cognitive factors. In other words, physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce emotional experience. In revisiting our example involving a venomous snake or a barking dog in your backyard, the two-factor theory maintains that the snake elicits sympathetic nervous system activation that is labeled as fear, given in the context, and an experience is that of fear. The Schachter-Singer theory suggests that physiological arousal is very similar across different types of emotions that we experience, and therefore cognitive appraisal of the situation is critical to the actual emotion experience. In fact, it might be possible to misattribute arousal to an emotional experience if the circumstances were right. Strong emotional responses are associated with strong physiological arousal. This has led some to suggest that the signs of physiological arousal, which include increased heart rate, respiration, and sweating, might serve as a tool to determine whether someone is telling the truth or not. The assumption is that most of us would show signs of physiological arousal if we were being dishonest with someone. A polygraph or lie detector test measures the physiological arousal in an individual responding to a series of questions. Someone trained to reading these tests would look for answers to the questions that are associated with increased levels of arousal as potential signs that the respondent may have been dishonest on those answers. The relationship between experience of our emotions and our cognitive processing of them, and the order in which these occur, remains a topic of research and debate. Arnold Lazarus developed the cognitive mediational theory that asserts that emotions are determined by our appraisal of a stimulus. If appraisal mediates between the stimulus and the emotional response, and it's immediate and often unconscious. In contrast to Schachter-Singer model, the appraisal precedes a cognitive label. You will learn more about Lazarus's appraisal if we talk about stress, health, and lifestyle. So basically, Lazarus is saying that what really counts is how we appraise the situation. So these four theories are illustrated in this diagram. You can pause and look at this if you like. The biology of emotions is a little different, though. Earlier we talked about the limbic system, which is part of the brain that's involved in emotion and memory. The limbic system includes the hypothalamus, the thalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus, essentially. The hypothalamus plays a role in activating the sympathetic nervous system. The thalamus serves as a sensory relay center to the neurons, to both the amygdala and the higher cortical regions, like the cerebral cortex. The amygdala plays a role in processing information and sending that information onto cortical structures. The hippocampus integrates emotional experience with cognition, and especially memory. If you remember where these were located in the brain, as illustrated. The amygdala has received a great deal of attention from researchers interested in understanding the biological basis of emotion, especially fear and anxiety. So the amygdala is composed of various subnuclei, including the basolateral complex and central nucleus. The basolateral complex is a dense connection with a variety of sensory areas of the brain. It's critical in classical conditioning and attaining emotional values to learning processes and memories. The central nucleus plays a role in attention. It has its connections with the hypothalamus and various brainstem areas to regulate autonomic nervous system and endocrine system activity. And you can see the two substructures of the amygdala. Human research also suggests a relationship between the amygdala and psychological disorders of mood and anxiety. Changes in amygdala structure and function have been demonstrated in teenagers and who are at risk or have been diagnosed with various mood and anxiety disorders. It has been suggested that functional differences in the amygdala could serve as biological markers to differentiate individuals suffering from bipolar disorder from those suffering from things like major depression. The hippocampus is also involved in emotional processing. Like the amygdala, research has demonstrated that the hippocampal structures and functions are linked to a variety of mood disorders. Individuals suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD, show marked reduction in the volume of several parts of the hippocampus, which may result from decreased levels of neurogenesis, that's neurons growing, and dendritic branching. While it's impossible to make a causal claim with correlational research like this, we talked about that in the second chapter, studies have demonstrated behavioral improvements and hippocampal volume increases following either pharmacological or cognitive behavior therapy in individuals with PTSD. Facial expressions also vary and are involved in the recognition of emotions. Cultures can impact the way people display emotions. A cultural display rule is one of the collection of culturally specific standards that govern the types and frequencies of emotional displays that are acceptable. Therefore, people from varying cultural backgrounds can have different cultural displays or rules of emotions. For example, research has shown that individuals in the United States express negative emotions like fear, anger, and disgust, both alone and in the presence of others, while Japanese individuals only do so while alone. Furthermore, individuals from cultures that tend to emphasize social cohesion are more likely to engage in suppression of emotional reactions so that they can evaluate which response is most appropriate in a given context. Other distinct cultural characteristics might be involved in emotionality. For example, there may be gender differences involved in emotional processing. While research into gender differences in emotional display is equivocal, that means questionable, there is some evidence that men and women may differ in regulation of emotions. Despite different emotional display rules, our ability to recognize and produce facial expressions of emotions appear to be universal. In fact, Even congenitally blind individuals produce the same facial expressions of emotion despite having never had the opportunity to observe others making the same facial displays of emotions. This would seem to suggest that the pattern of activity in facial muscles involved in generating emotional expressions is universal, and indeed this is the idea that Charles Darwin, in The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, demonstrated. In fact, there's substantial evidence that for 7 universal emotions that are each associated with distinct facial expressions. These include happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. Paul Ekman has developed the facial coding action system to empirically measure emotions. These are consistent across cultures and age groups.